This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
This week's ChangeMaker is Michael Novogradac, the managing partner of Novogradac, which has been providing professional services for over 30 years. Michael specializes in affordable housing, community development, historic preservation, and renewable energy. He's a respected thought leader, speaker, and an inductee of the Affordable Housing Hall of Fame. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I look forward to speaking with you today.
Your name has been around for quite a while as an icon in the industry. I've actually even heard, this is going to be funny, but I've heard you called the tax credit wizard even, which in my mind is something like Jedi-like, a rating here. But I suppose that's because tax credits are really so wildly popular and yet can be very mysterious and elusive. What do you think of this title that people have been calling you?
I don't know what to say about being called a tax credit wizard. Maybe I'll take you behind the curtain today and you'll see the secrets for the wizard.
Well, that's what I'm hoping. And we have such a wide array of listeners. I want to go at a macro level and explain to us some of the details. Maybe start with the low-income housing tax credit. That's a little more of the most popular or known. And then tell us what other platforms are existing and what you guys are working on.
Great. Thank you, Katie. Happy to do that. The low-income housing tax credit has been around since 1986. I actually started practicing in public accounting at a large accounting firm in 84. So the low-income housing tax credit was created in 1986 with the Tax Reform Act of 86. And then Novogradac was formed in 1989, a few short years thereafter. And the low-income housing tax credit is an incentive designed to enable real estate developers to build or renovate affordable rental housing and lease those units to low-income families at restricted rents. And the low-income housing tax credit has four key players in it. One, no surprise here, the developer. The developer is the entity that arranges the financing to construct and operate the affordable rental housing. The developer brings the contractors, architects, government officials, and all the rest together to build out the development. The developer is the central piece. The second key player is the low-income housing tax credit allocating agency. The beauty of the low-income housing tax credit, it is this tax credit, but it's allocated. And it's very much in demand. And it's allocated at the state level. New York City and Chicago have their own individual allocating agencies, but that's a bit into the details. But generally, it's a state allocated incentive. So the developer has to apply to the state allocating agency to get a right to claim the credits. There's also an ancillary way to get tax credits through using private activity bonds. But those are the foundational players. And then you also have, of course, the investors. The investors are a third player. They put equity capital into the development partnerships in exchange for the tax credits and tax losses. And then beyond the investors, of course, you have the lenders. And they make up the four key players to a tax credit transaction. And with that, you have a group that can build the housing and then operate it for at least 15 years. And then after 15 years, oftentimes investors will step away from the investment and the developer will continue. But the housing itself is set aside to be affordable for at least 30 years and can be longer.
So what is your take on why these are so competitive? And there's an obvious financial incentive, but this is such a competitive environment for developers, housing authorities. Explain to us the dynamics of that.
There is a huge need for affordable housing across the country, across suburban areas, urban areas, rural areas. That need for affordable rental housing is what drives the competition. There's a limited supply of tax credits that can be used to finance affordable housing. and there's a limited supply of private activity bonds that can also be used in combination with tax credits to finance affordable rental housing. So given the limited supply of this incentive and the broad need of affordable housing, you end up with states being overwhelmed with applications for the incentive. So that's what really drives the competitiveness, is the need for affordable housing. And it would be nice if we ever got to a place where affordable housing wasn't in such need that it would be so competitive. But there's such a huge gap. We can dream of getting to that place. Right now, we just have to be taking steps towards helping ease the affordable housing burden one development at a time.
So before I let you take your Jedi cloak off here, what are your predictions? Do you ever see a day where there's increased percentages? It's not a 4%. Do you think that there will be a future where it's higher, or, people are just scrambling for the fours, and we won't even talk about the 9%? But any prediction there?
Great question. Great question. Maybe for the listeners, I would note that the 9% credit is a deeper subsidy, and the 9% credit is allocated by the state agencies, and they get a certain amount based on population. The 4% credit, as a general matter, is combined with private activity bonds, and private activity bonds are bonds, as you know, Katie, that are the interest is tax exempt, slightly lower borrowing rate, and those are combined with 4% credits to also finance affordable rental housing. The 9% are oversubscribed in virtually every state. In those that it's not quite oversubscribed, there's just rounding differences that end up going like a national pool. The bonds are oversubscribed in roughly 40% of the states, and that oversubscription has been rising. So I think the question isn't really so much how much the credit percentage might be increased. It's more about increasing the volume of the credits. So there are efforts by housers to increase the amount of 9% credits available. Unfortunately, the credits actually decreased last year because there was a 12.5% boost that Congress had enacted for a 4-year period, and that expired and didn't get extended yet. And we're hopeful that 12.5% step up, if you will, in credits will get extended this year at some point. And then on the 4% private activity bond side, we're hopeful that Congress will change the way in which it works so that the existing level of bonds can produce twice as much housing. So right now, my hope and what we're working for, because hope isn't a strategy, but we're trying to convince Congress to give us the 12.5% back and more, if possible, of the 9%, and change the way in which the 4% works with private activity bonds, so twice as much housing can be built with the existing level of appropriation.
Those are good clarifications, and too bad the expiration happened. There was a lot going on. I do remember there was a cry in the housing industry to get their appropriators and legislators out to tax credit properties to have them go out and visit those. Do you see that as one successful strategy? Do you have other strategies on how to get buy-in to make sure these kinds of efforts are sustained?
I do think that getting members of Congress out to individual properties is foundational in terms of generating their support. I'm not aware of any member of Congress that went out and actually visited a tax credit property that didn't end up becoming a strong advocate for the incentive. Seeing is believing. And, I do think that, many members of Congress are surprised when they go out and visit a tax credit property because they have views of what affordable housing is, and they think affordable housing wouldn't look like market rate housing. And, the low-income tax credit is in essence, supporting housing that is interchangeable with market rate housing. And obviously has certain design features and all the rest, but you look at the property and it doesn't, cry out, oh, this is affordable housing. And I think that's a huge feature of the low-income tax credit.
As I'm listening to you, and out of curiosity, do you know about how many units are attributed to the low-income housing tax credit incentives? Like what is the pool that has been provided?
Yeah,
What should
the
we?
total number of units financed by the long-term tax credit is well north of 3 million since the incentive was created, and about 150,000 units are financed every year through the long-term housing tax credit.
Wow, that's amazing. That is a very robust tool for providing affordable housing.
No, it truly is. And I would note that that number is pretty steady year in and year out. And as a percentage of overall market rate multifamily, it can range anywhere from 30% or up. And it's really a function of how much market rate housing is also getting built. During the Great Recession, the LIHTC produced housing was 80, 90% of all units because the market rate just collapsed. And right now, total units are about 500,000 a year. So right now, the LIHTC is roughly 30% to 35% of the market.
We've been talking mostly about the low-income housing tax credit, but you guys use a lot of platforms and a lot of other financing tools. Why don't you go through some of those for us?
So the low-income tax credit, as you mentioned, is all about affordable rental housing and driving equity investment into affordable rental housing to allow the properties to be leased to low-income families at restricted rents. The new market tax credit was created back in 2000, and it is sort of the opposite of the long-term tax credit in the sense that it's designed to invest in and drive equity capital and below market financing to businesses that aren't residential rental housing. So it can be used for commercial housing, operating businesses, and the like. And in some ways, it's patterned after the long-term tax credit, however, serving needs beyond the affordable housing aspects of the LIHTC. I will note, though, that the new market tax credit is targeted to low-income communities. So you have to be a business as a general rule that's operating in a low-income community to be eligible for subsidized new market tax credit financing. And new market tax credit can be used for mixed-use housing and single family and home ownership. So you do see some of the new market tax credit being used to assist owners in terms of either buying or renting in a mixed use facility. So the new market tax credit would be another area that we work in that is driving capital, both debt and equity capital, to the low income communities. There's also the historic tax credit. The historic tax credit is an incentive to help developers cover the additional costs of renovating a property and retaining its historic character. And I would note that roughly half of the properties that claim historic tax credits are in low and moderate income communities. So it also is driving capital to low income areas. We do a lot with renewable energy, and there's a renewable energy tax credit, the investment tax credit, a 30% credit for investing in renewable energy such as solar. So that's another area that we work in that also can be used to drive capital to low income communities. And those are maybe the big four in terms of tax credits.
What is your favorite historic tax credit redevelopment that you've seen? Most people can identify with a school that's been renovated and reused for maybe senior housing. Do you have some examples or do you have a favorite that you want to share?
Katie, that's an unfair question.
Well,
You're
there's
going to
so
ask me
many
next
good,
who's my
there's
favorite
right.
child?
There's so many good examples of that historic tax credit. And quite frankly, some developers are a little leery of the older buildings and the dynamics and the reuse. But it is when they happen, they are so beautiful.
No, that's correct. I do not have a favorite. I don't have a favorite child, and I don't have well, they're all my favorites, I should say. It does run a gamut. I mean, there was a armory in Portland, Oregon that was renovated into serving as a theater facility. There was an old post office in St. Louis that was renovated into, commercial and office. There was a boiler making factory that the Navy had in Washington, D.C., that was converted into a mixed-use facility that has a brewery and office space and the rest. So there's a wide variety of uses for the historic tax credit. And it really, generally speaking, it ends up repurposing older buildings into new uses. And as you noted, retaining the historic character does come as at an added cost, and developers that work in this area, really are dedicated to the cause of preserving the heritage that these buildings represent. And it's good that the Congress saw the need to create a tax incentive to help subsidize the costs associated with retaining that historic character.
We've had a previous podcast guest who focused on preservation efforts related to historic buildings. And I love hearing the character stories, not just about the building, but the repurpose and the win about saving building materials and the sustainability aspects of that. Quite a whole unique endeavor. But I want to switch it here to renewable energy because that is a whole different genre. And I'm curious, you mentioned it about the solar credits. What is happening there? Because not many of us are well versed in that domain. So give us some more details on that.
So there was a huge renewable energy tax bill last year, as you know, the Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't sound like a bill for renewable energy, but the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted last year, and it provides a wide range of tax and appropriation incentives for clean and renewable energy. There was $369 billion in total in these tax incentives and spending. $270 billion of that is in the tax incentives piece, and roughly $100 billion is in spending. So on the spending side, let's talk a bit about affordable housing and low-income communities targeted there. There was $15 billion set aside for low-income communities through this greenhouse gas reduction fund, and that $15 billion is expected to be directed to community development financial institutions, and as I mentioned, for affordable housing and community development. So there's $15 billion there. There's also $8.8 billion through a couple of rebate programs for single and multifamily housing through the Department of Energy, and another $1 billion for green retrofits of privately owned HUD-assisted housing. And then on the tax incentive side, in terms of the big one that we're seeing with respect to multifamily housing is the fact that the credit wasn't quite 30%. They brought it back to 30%. So it's 30% for putting solar, on a property, a 30% tax credit. But beyond that 30%, there's also a 20% boost for affordable rental housing. So now we're seeing, clients that could get up to a 50% tax credit for putting solar on new construction renovations, or they could form a separate entity to own the solar and put it on existing properties that are already in service. And the sort of the breaking news on the podcast for this is this extra 20% bonus ITC that can be used for affordable housing has a limit to it. And since there's a limit to it, you have to apply for the right to claim this 20% bonus. And just the other day, the IRS came out with a notice that discusses the details as to how to go about and apply for this 20% bonus. And this 20% this IRS notice is now being reviewed by us at Novogradac and others. And we also have a long-standing tax credit working group that's reviewing it pretty closely. And it looks like sometime in May, clients will be able to begin to apply for this 20% bonus. So when you think about the cost of putting solar on a property, now you'll get a 30% credit, potentially if you are successful in applying, get 20% back. So 50% of the cost of the solar will be funded through these tax credits, and it'll make it much more financially feasible to include solar on affordable housing.
That should definitely create some movement and momentum there.
That's right.
Well, on that note, let's take a break, Mike. But coming up in the second part of my talk with Michael Novogradac, the managing partner of Novogradac. Mike talks about his organization's mission and vision.
All the various areas in which we practice are really focused on equity and providing capital to low-income families and low-income communities.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.